Berserk wouldn't be the series it is without the presence of the god-awful Apostles. These demonic reincarnates started off as the main enemy type for our hero Guts to tear his way through en route to Griffith, but through a bizarre twist of fate, they're now the defenders of humanity as well. Odd that, considering humans are usually part of an Apostle's diet, but then again, they're being kept in line by their god on Earth. Still, the reason we bring them up today isn't to discuss their lives, but their appearances, because some of their transformations are downright terrifying. In this video, we're going to be addressing the scariest Apostle transformations from Berserk, and before you ask too many questions, yes, we'll do our best to account for the unnamed ones as well. So, without further ado, let's dive right into it. Female Apostle. The very first Apostle we meet in Berserk sets the tone for her entire species, because to call her transformation scary would be an understatement. The female Apostle first appeared during the Eclipse from a chronological perspective, and right from the beginning, we knew there was something wrong about a naked woman in the middle of a hellscape reaching out for Corcus of all people. Even he knew how bizarre and dreamlike his situation was, but Corcus being Corcus couldn't help himself and he buried his face in the woman's bosom. What he thought was a dream turned out to be a living nightmare when the woman transformed into an apostle as Corcus held on to her. In her release state, the female apostle is a hideous monster whose abdomen and torso remain as the only signifiers of her humanity. Her legs turn thick and muscular, her arms grow longer with claws replacing nails, and her head is the worst of all. Her beautiful mouth turns into a disgusting maw lined with pointed teeth that go well beyond the old 32. It can open wide enough to house a human head inside of it, and unfortunately for Corcus, he can tell you that from experience. Her hair becomes tendrils that twist and grow in all directions, looking more like alien appendages than anything else. She spawns two rudimentary wings from her head, which clearly can't help her fly considering her body weight, but serve to reinforce the terror of her true nature instead. She can swallow a man's body whole, but prefers to chomp him down in size, leaving his head for last. The female apostle was the first apostle we met canonically speaking, because Berserk's very first chapter opens with Guts killing her, and to be honest with you guys, her look is one of the things that sold us on this series. The fact that she went from seductive blonde woman to mother predator in a second set the tone for the darkness that was to come, and having seen her in all her glory, we're sure you agree with our assessment of her scariness. Slug Count. A lot of the creep factor for Apostle designs comes from the fact that Miura incorporates viscera into it in the most unique and disturbingly imaginative ways. It makes sense considering their embodiments of sin and unbridled promiscuity is one of the greatest sins, but something about seeing a guy with the body of an anthropomorphic snake and a mouth shaped like a vagina just sends a discomforting tingle down our spines. Still, Snake Lord's released form is more expected than scary, and it's only his face that's uncomfortable to look at. In the case of the Slug Count, it's his entire body, because the entire body is shaped like a massive penis. We're not kidding either, just look at this aerial shot of his body from Guardian Angels of Desire Part 4 and tell us you don't see it. That's okay, we see it too, it's alright. But that isn't actually what makes the Slug Count's transformation so scary to behold, to be honest. Although it doesn't help that Miura went all in on the veins and warts. As his name suggests, the Count's body is inspired by the design of a slug, which is made most evident by the shape of his head. Or should we say heads, because he technically has two of them. His normal face is perpetually flashing an evil grin, buried inside a larger slug face complete with bulging eyes and a terrifying second mouth. His abdomen is long enough to give him a surprising range of motion for his girth, and the base of his body has two large tout legs and countless arms spawning nearby them. If he wanted to, the Count could make these hands spawn demonic mouths and manifestations of his own face like he did when he devoured his wife during his first ascension. And, as if that wasn't terrifying enough, Slug Count can create pseudo-apostles by making people swallow a parasitic worm that bears his face and lives inside his body. It's some of the grossest visuals that we've ever come across in the series, and the phallic design of the Count himself is something that's etched into our minds for eternity. Not that we want it to be there, mind you. It just kinda wormed its way in. Vlad Tepes. This apostle transformation is on the list for two reasons. One, because it happens right after the transformer loses an eye, and two, it's the prototype design for all apostles. Vlad Tepes was a part of Kentaro Miura's prototype for Berserk, and can we just point out how manga artists seem to be obsessed with the Impaler? Miura's prototype has Vlad in it, Hellsing's main character is supposed to be Vlad himself, so is Castlevania's main antagonist and Vampire Hunter D's. But unlike those Drac impersonators, Miura's Vlad Tepes has the distinction of being an apostle of Vwana, the evil god that was going to be Miura's antagonist before the God Hand. Vlad's flesh is cold and his body has a stinky sweet smell which only emanates from dead bodies. But underneath his human appearance lurks a demonic bullhog that's ready to destroy his own castle at the drop of a hat. What makes Vlad's transformation so unsettling is the fact that he plucks out his eyeball right before he does it. When the process is complete, he emerges as an anthropomorphic bullhog with massive horns and arms that reach the ground. His claim to fame is managing to get a hold of Guts after showering him with fragments of broken pillars, but his life ends as soon as we're introduced to it. Guts fills his mouth full of shot and then slices him open like he does countless apostles across the main series, and for a prototype apostle, Vlad Tepes is pretty scary if you ask us. He'd been luring young girls to his castle as tributes so he could abuse them to his heart's content, and if Guts hadn't dealt with him when he did, he'd have continued inflicting that fate upon countless others. Zod! The immortal specter of Berserk is definitely going to make you wish you were asleep and dreaming about his presence if you ever have the misfortune of crossing paths with him. Zod has the perfect apostle body, as it allows him to fight on land, in air, and at sea. His upper body and head are modeled after a lion's, while his feet are hooved, giving him propulsion as he gallops. His paws look like gorilla arms, and his horns rival those of a bison. If all that wasn't enough for you, he's got a tail with a wicked reach and a pair of massive leather wings. Batman's cape has nothing on Zod's because when you see his silhouette flying across the night sky, you're not wrong in assuming it's a demon. But what truly makes Zod's apostle transformation scary is the rarity with which he uses it. Unless and until he finds an opponent worthy of his full power, Zod never reveals it. Instead, he chooses to dispatch his enemies in his base form as much as he can because to him, that's the only way he can gauge if a person matched his criteria for absolute strength. If Zod unleashes his true form, it's going to be the last thing you ever see in this world, unless of course you're Guts. The Black Swordsman is the only swordsman, apart from Skull Knight, who has fought Zod multiple times and lived to tell the tale. Most die almost instantly, or suffer in their final moments as they're violently ripped apart by the Black Lion of Berserk. He's spread death across countless battlefields in his 300 years of life, and Guts and Skull Knight are the only ones that can rival him in his true form. He might be serving as Griffith's personal chariot and glorified lapdog at the moment, but if you want a reminder on how badass and terrifying Zod can be, just read through his fight with Guts on the Hill of Swords. Wild! For most of you guys, this entry makes perfect sense, but for those of you who haven't read the manga, let's dive into why Wild was one of the scariest transformation moments in Berserk history. See, when Wild was introduced, we'd only met one other apostle, that being Zod. While Zod left an unforgettable impression on our minds, he also stopped the first battle with Guts and Griffith deliberately, giving him an air of mystery and certainty. Zod could have killed them easily if he wanted to, he just didn't do it because he knew what was meant for the future, and he was also intrigued. He isn't a bloodthirsty monster who kills for the sake of eating, and he doesn't plant his seed in every womb he can violate. That would be Wild, and his apostle form is the stuff of true horrors. In his base form, Wild looks like a giant hairy man with an unsavory ape-like aspect to his frame. Turns out, that's because he turns into an ape as a fully formed apostle, only he's got a set of extremely, well, let's call them unique physical features. From the waist down, he looks like a silverback gorilla, only he's King Kong-sized. Or, for fans of The Flash, Solivar-sized. It's what's above his torso that makes him so unsettling. Wild's original upper body becomes the head of his transformed state, and a giant mouth appears across his neckline. Above this mouth, he has a single vertical eye, and on both of his ape shoulders, he has eyes as well. He looks more like an alien ape than a demonic one until he whips out his favorite tool. Wild's prostate gets absorbed into his silverback booty when he transforms, so if he wants to violate people, he has to use another penis, the tongue of his second mouth. What makes this especially disgusting is that this phallus is covered with spikes and has a protruding, we want to say, pleasure drill? Except when this thing gets inside you, it's liable to shred your insides as you die a slow, agonizing death. Everything about Wild is disgusting, and that's what makes him so scary. When he transformed for the first time in Chapter 63, you felt as though you were witnessing a true monster in action, and he certainly lived up to the billing. This goddamn gorilla was so resilient that it took another apostle, Zod to be specific, to put an end to his depravity. Had the Immortal One not arrived in time, this murderous, rapacious ape would have made the Eclipse an afterthought if given half a chance to do so. Rosine full released form. Rosine debuted shortly before the Eclipse when some apostles took a detour in chapter 52, but her form from that chapter isn't what we're talking about here. Sure, she looks rather creepy, what with her being a human-sized elf with wings sprouting from her head and a stinger jutting out of her back, but it's still a form we can digest, especially now that we've seen Danon. What we can't digest is her full released form because that's the stuff of nightmares, and there's a possibility we won't even see it coming. From behind, Rosine looks like a giant, majestic Luna moth, thrice the size of Guts. It's the front end that will keep you up for the rest of your days. Her lower body is a massive glowing bioengine that exists for one purpose, boosting her speed. Her upper body rests within the facial cavity of her Luna moth body, and she has the 6 legs that those critters have as well, but surrounding them are a bunch of suction tubes. These tubes suck in air at an alarming rate, sending it down to her lower body, where it's pressurized and released at such intensity that Rosine can fly at supersonic speeds. Aside from the 2 beautiful golden antennae that a Luna moth has, Rosine also has an enhanced proboscis protruding from the middle of her moth head, which she can harden or control at will like a whip. This, combined with her speed, essentially turns her into a supersonic missile, minus the explosion. Now, just imagine Rosine closing in on you after breaking the sound barrier like she does in the last panel from chapter 112 of Berserk. Even Guts was semi-panicking trying to figure out how to fight something he can't see whilst reeling from the ringing in his ears. In fact, the only reason he survived his encounter with Rosine is because one of his arms is metal, which allowed him to hitch a ride on her proboscis. Guts had to get himself impaled on purpose to defeat Rosine, which should tell you just how powerful she is, and even when he blasted her lower body with his arm cannon, she survived long enough to make it to Jill. If she hadn't redeemed herself by the end, Rosine flying away in her final moments would have been far more troubling than it was, because she gave Guts a better fight than even Zod had up until then, and that's saying something. Eclipse Apostles! The Eclipse is the most well-known plot point in Berserk, and with good reason. It's the cause for the main conflict of the series, and is directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. But what truly makes it such an ugly, unforgettable experience is the sheer number of apostles that partake in it and the many horrifying forms they take. The eclipse is supposed to take place within a surreal dimension, so when Miura drew his apostles preparing for the feast in chapter 76, he made it look like they're all blurring into one another, one nightmarish form after the next. Just in this scene alone, you see hideous creatures like a giant spider with a human face across its back, a pterodactyl with a human face across its belly, multiple centipede slug-like demons with varied numbers of eyes, mouths, and faces, and a whole lot worse. Everything we see from the ending of chapter 78 to the end of chapter 88 is pure horror fiction, and we'd be here all day if we tried describing every apostle that Miura left nameless in those chapters. So instead, we'll just talk about 2 of the more notable ones just to show you how grotesque even the small ones can be. In chapter 84, after impaling an apostle who had a gargoyle's anatomy on one side of its body and a succubus's on the other, Guts comes across the sole survivor of his raider unit, Gaston. Gaston is glad to see his captain, but like the rest of the Falcons, he's losing his mind to the horrors of the eclipse. He calls his entire life since joining the band one big dream, but before he can say anything else, his face begins to stretch and then bursts open as a small apostle emerges. This apostle, let's call him Spinebuster, has a face inside of its mouth and both its tongues loll out of them like dead appendages. He has tentacles like an incubus, but his tail is a column of spine. He kills people by eating them from the inside and bursting out of their bodies, and though he's far smaller than the rest of the Eclipse demons, he still makes us wish we hadn't read that chapter. Then, there are the penis demons that surround Casca at the end of chapter 81. We wish we had a better name for them, but trust us when we say that's the most accurate description we can provide. These dozen or so apostles that cornered Casca after she lost judo all look like a woman's worst nightmare, multiple phalluses waiting to violate her without restraint. Reading chapter 85 will make it even clearer why we call this crop of apostles penis demons, as will the fact that their forms embedded themselves within Casca's broken mind as a buried interpretation of the eclipse. In chapter 352, we see Farnace and Shirke make their way into the inner recesses of Casca's mind, and what they find there are multiple penis-shaped demons, all of whom are a representation of the trauma Casca endured during the eclipse. Perhaps that's the reason we haven't seen any of the Eclipse demons make a return in the series, despite all apostles now aligning with Griffith. Well, most of them, anyway. Borov! One of the only Eclipse demons to make recurring appearances after the Eclipse, Borov is on this list for two reasons. The first we've already stated, and the second is that he's the guy responsible for Guts being an arm short. Physically, Borov's appearance feels pretty normal for an apostle's, considering he looks like a giant salamander for the most part. His body is at least 5 times the size of a regular human's, his jaw could swallow horses whole, his 6 legs gave him insane acceleration when he's running, and he's got a club tail with which he can bring down giants. His entire body is covered in armor so thick that a full-size sword can barely make a dent in it. In fact, when Guts tried to stab him with one repeatedly, it broke off, and Borov's armor was unblemished. But that isn't what makes him so eerie. What makes him eerie is the fact that his actual upper body rises up out of the lower end of his salamander body like a ghost stuck within its body. The salamander's mouth is technically Borov's belly, giving us one of the most hideous belly mouths in manga history. Its grip is so intense that Guts had to amputate himself to get out of it, and it can one-shot kill ogres by tearing out their bellies. Borov's actual upper body seems to be more susceptible to damage, as a thwack on the head with a spiked club from an ogre busted him open, but believe it or not, he's a skilled warrior as well. As part of the Demon Lancer unit of Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon, it's Borov's job to be a part of every cavalry charge Griffith orders, and some of them he participates in with his released form. His lance is longer than his entire body, and though his shield is tiny by comparison, it still does a decent job of keeping his weak spot protected. The only thing more dangerous than an apostle is an apostle trained for war, so we can't wait to see how Borov is further incorporated into the story. So far, he's been the flagship gladiator of Pandemonium, and the man that helped Griffith create his biggest diversion in his battle with Ganishka. We can still hear the grinding of his belly teeth as Guts tried to free himself of his grasp to reach Casca, and failed, time and again. Besides wanting to see him brought to justice for aiding and abetting in the worst crime of Berserk, we want to see Guts get payback for his lost arm. So, despite being one of the most traumatic apostles in the series, we'd say Borov is in for the worst time of his life in the near future, provided Studio Gaga doesn't draw this thing out too long. Speaking of Borov, War Demons! Once Griffith took form in the physical world, he became a beacon for all apostles because he was literally their god on Earth. His will became their will, and they wouldn't dare question it. They flocked to his light and became his new beacon talons, but apostles are apostles, and there are a lot of them in the reborn Band of the Falcon. Dubbed the War Demons, they're split into multiple units, like any regular army, with each unit consisting of dozens of soldiers. Borov from the previous entry is a lancer who belongs to the unit captained by Sir Locus. Locus isn't on this list because his transformation is more majestic than scary, but the same can't be said for his men, as evidenced by this panel from chapter 233. The War Demons are given a more extensive look across all the following battles that they partake in, and you guys decide if you'd want to fight alongside them or run away from them. This is a snapshot of Griffith's aerial apostle unit from chapter 276. Tell us, what rational human being would fight alongside creatures that look like that? Between chapters 298 and 307, the Falcon of Light achieves something entirely unprecedented. He manages to make his human soldiers accept the existence of his demonic ones and coordinate a counterattack on his enemies that is as fluid as water. He gets a lot of help from Sonya, of course, but being a God Hand member, he must have foreseen that because there's no way that regular God-loving folks would ever do what the Midland regular army did in that final battle. Just look at the size of one of Griffith's War Demon giants that isn't even Grunbeld. This whale demon alone could probably crush all human soldiers out of existence. Chapter 97 is like a painting from hell, with many of the penis demons making a return for good measure. If Sonya hadn't used her thought manipulation powers en masse when she did, the people would have turned against the love of her life because chapter 299 is the closest that future Falconians ever came to realizing Griffith's true nature. Before her interjection, all human elements of the Band of the Falcon were ready to abandon the campaign and even questioned why Griffith was working with literal demons because they correctly surmised that they'd been tricked into fighting alongside them all this time. If they'd just stuck with that thought, maybe they would have realized they're being used as fuel for the Age of Darkness. But no, they had to fall for Sonya's "it doesn't matter if we're humans or demons because we're all Falcons" speech. Their blindness is going to cost them dearly in the future because some of the apostles that the Falconians rode into battle are liable to turn around and eat them as soon as their commanders turn their backs. And now that Berserk is inching closer to its finale, that liability can come due anytime the writers want. Father Mosus! It's one thing for the followers of a religion to be misguided by their faith, it's another thing for a priest of said faith to not realize that his powers came from the devil and not God, but that's the reality if your name is Mosus. The Bloody Inquisitor was a pretty terrifying individual even before he turned into a pseudo-apostle, but with him advocating torture as the highest form of devotion. Any man that has ruined his kneecaps by performing prostrations on the daily isn't to be messed with, and Mosus proves that when he turns into a pseudo. His base form gives his skin a stone-like appearance and grants him the ability to breathe fire and sprout wings, but it's his released form that gives Guts one of the toughest fights of his life. He dive bombs this dude's chest with Dragon Slayer after running down the side of the Tower of Rebirth, and all it does is shred his Bible apart. Mosus's released form armor is so tough the Dragon Slayer can't even crack it. Guts tried shoving it down the bestial priest's throat in order to hurt his insides, but he only ended up giving Mosus the chance to chomp down on his blade. That was prevented with a well-timed throwing knife to his eye, but it did nothing for the rest of his bag of tricks. Mosus's scales made him impervious to damage, while his fist-like wings give him insane range for dealing damage. He can split his wings into 1,000 appendages and unleash a barrage of fists that he calls the God 1000 Arm Cannon. Anyone that isn't Guts has no chance of surviving this attack of Mosus's, and neither can they survive his God Breath because they don't have a sword wide enough to hide their entire frame behind. The unstoppable nature of his release state makes Mosus scary enough, but what puts him over the edge is his obsession with divinity and his utter negligence of the fact that he's being powered by evil. Mosus repeatedly and vehemently claims that his power is a blessing from God, and that God opposing him proves he's a heretic. He uses the greater good argument and asks why sacrificing Casca is so bad when it could save thousands, unaware that it wouldn't have the effect he was hoping it would. He even cries tears of blood for his fallen disciples, which would be touching if it wasn't so damn disturbing. His blind faith makes his powers that much more dangerous, and if Guts hadn't discovered a literal chink in his armor at the last possible moment, this demonic angel would have wiped the floor with him. Mosus technically wasn't an apostle, but Guts acknowledged his power as being on par with one, so he's on the list. Grunbeld! Imagine you're walking around a battlefield just trying to escape with your life, honor be damned, and you come across a hulking, corundum-skinned, four-legged dragon that probably weighs several tons more than you'd think it could. What would your reaction be? If you answered you're not going to wait around for the flames to come out, then you'd be correct, because trying to fight Grunbeld in any form is asking to be killed without mercy. In his base form, he's a 20-foot giant with a shield that can fire and repel cannonballs and a warhammer that would embarrass Robert Baratheon. That's enough to make us want to wear our brown pants, but it's when he transforms that we don't have a choice in the matter. Grunbeld's release state sees him transform into a flame-breathing dragon, capable of lifting pillars as large as the ones found at Stonehenge like they were chew toys for puppies. His entire body is composed of stone and crystalline spikes, which makes him unimaginably durable. It took Berserker Guts all the propulsion he could create with his limit-breaking armor to put a dent in Grunbeld's skin, and killing him will require a lot more than a crack. His tail has enough force to break a person's bones as it kills them, and he can spit fireballs hot enough to cook men alive in their armor. Grunbeld's by far the most formidable apostle in Griffith's Reborn Bound to the Falcon, and he's going to be a major obstacle in Guts' path forward. Not counting Zod, of course. Irvine! Having the lower body of a one-eyed wolf and the upper body of a demonic satyr doesn't really sound that scary, does it? It sounds more like a fantasy creature, at least until you see Irvine in action and realize that he's probably worse than Grunbeld. Not because he can split flames or because he has unbreakable skin, but because Irvine is the ultimate hunter. In his base form, he's Carmelo Hayes' catchphrase, but unlike the man himself, he actually never misses. His bow can decapitate humans straight up, and he can fire up to a half-dozen arrows at the same time. When he transforms into his release state, his accuracy and his ability to deal damage increases exponentially, thanks to the way his body's shaped. Irvine's wolf head is crowned by a couple of horns that quite conveniently function as makeshift ballista. He can pull out his tail fur and fashion them into arrows that expand upon impact, and we don't just mean that they grow in size. No, Irvine's arrows release spikes in every direction that shred their target's insides and exit their bodies from multiple critical points, leaving them as good as dead, if not actually dead. Watching him stride into battle looking to hunt you down is the most fear you can experience, especially since he never misses his mark. Baron Balzac. Before you start making fun of his name, we'll have you know that Baron Balzac has one of the most outrageous apostle forms across all Berserk media. That's right, Berserk media, because technically he's not a canonical apostle. Balzac is a part of the Sword of Berserk, Guts' Rage PlayStation 2 game. He's actually the main antagonist, and his story mirrors the Slug Counts quite closely. Yet, We think it would have been a better shout having Balzac in the series because his apostle form is the definition of demonic chimera. His lower body has 4 heads, a fish's, a wolf's, a tiger's, and that of the apostle whose face within face within face we see in the first page of chapter 79. His tail has a snake head on it, and his upper body looks like his torso merged with that of a dragon. He fights guts using an axe and a pole axe, and when we tell you we're glad he's not canon, we mean it. Their encounter in the game might have been short, but Balzac's rebirth ritual is etched into our minds and in the kind of way that makes us want to laser it the F out of there. Shivaganishka and his spawn. Okay, scratch everything we said just now because there's not one apostle transformation that we want to forget. There's actually 2, and this is the second. Emperor Ganishka's original apostle form isn't exactly scary as much as it is strategic. He turns himself into a thundercloud. That allows him to do a bunch of different things on the battlefield, apart from frying his enemies to death. But once his trick is exposed, he needs a much stronger form to achieve his goal of defeating Griffith. That's when he decides to lower himself into the man-made Behelit and be reborn as the equivalent of a demon god. Ganishka's Shiva form is indescribable in that it can only be called the embodiment of evil. The sheer scale of its body breaches the atmosphere and puts its head in the stars, never mind the clouds. His entire upper half is covered in eldritch manifestations of his own head, and he has more arms than he has use for. When Shivaganishka walks, he kills hundreds of people with each step, and worse than that, he turns them into hideous pseudo-spawns that all bear his likeness but look malformed and always leak blood. He can exhale so much fire, he makes it look like the biblical end times have arrived, and he can cover hundreds of miles in just a few steps. We hate to say it, but had Griffith not killed this guy as part of his grand plan, we don't know if the world would have survived at all, because Shivaganishka would have destroyed everything. He truly felt like a Lovecraftian monster upon his debut in the series, and he remains one of the scariest apostle transformations, hands down. We should all be glad that he isn't alive anymore to see his countrymen being slaughtered by a traitor, but that's a story for another video. Marvelous verdict! Unfortunately, that's all we got for you guys. Let us know in the comments down below which apostle transformation you find the scariest, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content. This is Wizard Wheezy signing off for now, but you can always find me on Twitch, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.